Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of Receivables Roundtable. Today, I am here with my friend Sara Woggerman, who is an industry expert in the compliance and operations space, and we're going to have a fun conversation today. Sara is the president and owner of ARM Compliance Business Solutions, and she's been in the industry for a while, and she's got some really exciting stuff for us today. Sara, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I think that perfect balance of compliance and performance is such an important topic. But let's start with the basics. I always like to start with my personal favorite question. Can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in today?
Sure. So it was over 15 years ago when I entered into this industry, and I started for a subsidiary of Portfolio Recovery Associates. So who knew I was joining one of the largest debt buyers at the time, still is today. And probably when I started, I would have not thought that I'd still be here 15 years later. But I literally started by going to town hall meetings, teaching municipalities across the Southeast how to keep accurate records so that we could collect their debt for them so they wouldn't go bankrupt. So I got a crash course really fast in, excuse me, debt collection, some of the problems with obtaining records and data integrity and all of that type of stuff. So from there, I moved into an agency, outsourced agency management role with PRA, directly under them, and then managed their legal network as well until my path took me to asset acceptance, where I also managed agencies. So this is more when I was on the performance-based side. And then I strategically shifted when the CFPB was really, looking at our industry and just starting to. And so I thought, well, maybe I should see about this compliance stuff. So then I went to another debt buyer, worked on compliance there, and then ended up at Ontario System, where I started doing consulting work under Roseanne Anderson until I started my own company 2 years ago. So that's sort of my, unique experience. I've managed probably hundreds of collection agencies at this point. I've been in hundreds of collection agencies, whether it was from that performance side or the compliance side, right? So I have a really unique perspective into what works, what doesn't work, what challenges companies in general have, and how to overcome those challenges.
Well, I think that's why we're going to have such a fun conversation today, because I think that unique perspective really helps us to identify those items that allow that balance between collecting money and doing it compliantly. And you can never go too far in one direction, right? If you go too hard compliance, you never make any money. If you go too hard on the collecting, you find yourself with compliance issues, and you have to find that perfect balance. And there's a lot of different ways in which that happens. But let's start by talking just a little bit about ARM Compliance Business Solutions and what you guys do there. Can you tell everybody a little bit about the organization?
Yeah, so we are an advisory company for all matters of operational compliance, right? So we do everything from RMAI certification audits to really detailed, in-depth compliance risk assessments that help prepare you for an examination from a regulatory body such as the CFPB. In between there, for mid-size or smaller companies, we do things, we can be your outsourced compliance officer. So if you can't afford a compliance officer, we can provide that service to you. And then there's lots of things we can customize in between there, but that's really the scope. We're not attorneys. And so we often will work hand in hand with someone's legal counsel when legal issues may arise, but we help you do all the nuts and bolts, the day-to-day stuff. So hopefully you don't have to call your attorney because you're getting, a lot of litigation.
So you're operationalizing compliance.
Yes. Yep,
All right. Well,
that's
and that's
right.
going to lead us down the path of today's discussion, right? So, one of the things I know as we were kind of planning for this, we were talking about some of these really in-depth, detailed CFPB pre-check audits, or whatever language you're using, in preparing for those. Can you tell everybody a little bit about the operational value of going through these detailed pre-audits?
Yeah. So what often happens in all size companies is that you begin to operate sort of with blinders on, right?
Mhm.
So you think things are working good, and then something over here breaks, and it breaks all these things over here. And it could be systemic, it could be cultural, it could be you lost a specific leader. There's lots of reasons why things break down within an organization. And then you've got a big mess on your hand. The whole point of a risk assessment is to identify one, um, what those things could be that could break so it's not catastrophic to your business, but also so that you can close those gaps and actually have a better functioning company. So my
Mhm.
goal in any engagement is to, and as cheesy as this might sound, I mean it with like all of my heart, is to make that organization the best they can be with what they want to accomplish, right? So whether that is, increase revenue and close compliance risks, that's usually what people tell me. Um, that's what we're going to do with the tools that you have. We're going to talk about whether or not technology needs to be brought in. We're going to assess all of those things, right? Um, the other piece of this is to truly understand what is the risk of certain activities.
Mhm.
This is something that is fundamentally sort of missing, I think, in a lot of conversations. And so I always take people back to go, compliance people will often call me and the house is on fire. I found this. Oh my gosh, the house is on fire. Okay, is the house really on fire? How many accounts were impacted? Let's talk about what was the risk? What is our exposure? What do we need to do? Understanding that risk element is really critical to understanding how to respond to things when they break down. And
Mhm.
that's what a compliance risk assessment will help you. And sometimes you need an outside person to kind of help you understand that risk. Sometimes you might think, oh, this isn't a big risk, but
Hmm.
really it is a huge risk,
Yeah.
right? And when you kind of lay that out to them, or vice versa, why are you so conservative on this? Why are you so afraid to send an email, for example, when here's the reality of the risk. It's not really that risky, right? And so when
Mhm.
I break that down for people, um, it helps the compliance people who are just, and they're doing their job, right? They're trying to make sure all the guardrails are up. Um, but the ops people are going, wait, are we losing opportunity? And there's something in between there that's where I try to help companies find that in between to make everybody comfortable.
So it sounds like you've basically come up with some scoring mechanisms for managing this risk
Mm-hmm.
tolerance level, because
Yes.
every organization has inherent risk, right? Every time that a consumer is
Yes.
on the phone with the collector, there's risk. Every time we send a communication, we send an email, whatever we do, there's always some inherent risk. And what you've done is find kind of this mathematical solution to help measure that risk assessment, right? So it's not just I'm doing right or I'm doing wrong, but you have to find risk tolerance levels for each organization and then
Mm-hmm.
demonstrate for them this activity represents this level of risk because it's seeing
Mm-hmm.
this level of account. So it sounds like you're building more or less a risk algorithm for each one of these organizations to help them better understand how they could be impacted based on different activities so that they can measure the performance aspect of,
Mm-hmm.
hey, if I'm going to send out emails, here's the performance lift that I'm looking at, but here's the inherent risk that I'm going to have to be willing to accept in order to
Mm-hmm.
get here. Does that sound
Right.
about right?
Yeah, that was perfectly said, Adam. It's always about, okay, and when you accept those risks, right? So one of the famous things I always say to my clients is I almost will never tell you no unless you're asking me to do something egregious, right?
Mhm.
I'm going to say, how do we control it? Okay, I'm going to use an example that is starting to be talked about in our industry, but isn't talked about a lot. If you want to start using WhatsApp,
Mhm.
Okay, it's a
Sure.
completely new technology. It's not, but RegF was developed to open up new communication channels. So if you want to communicate with people internationally, WhatsApp is actually your best option, right?
Mhm.
So I
Sure.
know some people in the student loan space are using it, but how do you control it? That's the question. It's not no, you can't use it. Is we need to understand the technology and we need to understand how we are going to monitor, audit, and control it to make sure. And then if something, again, a strong compliance management system, if you start seeing, lawsuits or complaints go up, well, then you might adjust how you do things, but it doesn't mean you don't dip your toe in the water, right? Like, doesn't mean that we
Makes
live in
sense.
fear. I think that's been one of the things that has held this industry back from progress. And RegF helped to kind of get our heads out of the sand and a little bit, but there's still nervous Nellies out there when it comes to like digital communications. So
150%. And so from my seat, I've seen organizations as RegF has come around. I think the government's looking at it and being like, why aren't you using more communication levels? And I think that organizations are struggling to monitor this risk level, and not just from a compliance perspective, but also from a technology risk perspective, right?
mhm,
And so because we talk about risk, like there's compliance related risks, right? Like the risk of litigation, the risk of complaints, the risk of having to deal with the AGs, the regulators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also these like technology risks that people I don't think always necessarily assess a value to. And what I mean by that is like if we're going to start sending out thousands and hundreds of
mhm,
thousands of emails, well, what does that mean in terms of the risk to our domain? Right, like our online
mhm,
domain, is that going to have a negative effect on our website? Is that going to have a negative effect on our ability to deliver emails normally, right,
mhm.
like to our clients and all of that? Because if we're emailing through the same domains, and I think that's why you have some organizations that have been successful in using email generally have deliverability teams, right? And they have whole
Yes.
groups of people that are specifically focused on managing that particular risk level, because there's no coming back from that risk. You might be able to settle a lawsuit, but you can't settle with Google. Like once they've
Hmm.
blacklisted your domain, you're kind of blacklisted.
You're right. And the
Um,
same thing's happening with text messaging right now, right?
yes.
So yes, I agree with you on all of that.
And I imagine the same thing is happening on WhatsApp, right? And I'd never really considered it, but like I have offices globally. I have a lot of friends around the
Mhm.
globe, and I use WhatsApp to communicate with all of them because it's considerably easier than sending text messages and considerably cheaper at
Yeah.
that. Right. So looking at some of those technologies and how are they going to start to come together, I think is a really interesting way to look at all of this. Now, as you go through these kind of like these really deep dive compliance evaluations, are you looking at some of these tech risks and some of those things and helping
Yes.
people to measure what that actually means?
Yes. Of course, we've built all of that into it. So and obviously, there's the safe harbor
Mhm.
language within RegF, but then it also has to contemplate the risk level because really the safe harbors for digital communications is only to protect you from third party disclosure, nothing else.
Mhm.
So there's all these other elements, right? You've got the FDCPA, you've got TCPA in some situations, so there's other things that we're going to be looking at. But and speaking of the technology piece, I think this is where this might be the most risky decision that you make is what vendor do you use to help deploy that? So you talked about the domain, understanding their relationships with the Googles of the world,
Mhm.
or how about the carriers specifically?
Mhm.
Um, One thing, when I was at the executive summit, I was talking with somebody, and one of the things that came up was I don't think most people realize that the actual sheriff here in text messaging world is your Verizons,
Mhm.
T-Mobiles, AT&Ts. Like
Yes.
they are the sheriffs. Okay.
Mhm.
Yes, you have to be worried about the CFPB and all this stuff, but ultimately, if they don't like you, and they're not going to let your text be sent, right? So
Mhm.
your vendor having a relationship with those wireless carriers and a good relationship with them is actually pretty critical. So, those are maybe things that as people have been bringing on new vendors, didn't really realize, and now they're going, wait, why are my text messages not being delivered? Um, Another challenge in that area is the data coming back. You get so much information from digital and electronic communications, but is that being consumed correctly in a way that helps you optimize performance?
Hmm.
Because I think once you optimize performance, I think you also are more compliant. I think that a digital communication strategy can help your compliance risk. And I know people think that it's the opposite. And nobody wants phone calls.
Yeah.
Nobody wants another phone call from a debt collector. So um, these, I think all of these tools are great. I think they help us accomplish two things. I think from a performance standpoint, I think it will increase collections, and I think you will actually be able to manage compliance way more effectively.
I agree. I mean, look, the compliance risk in a phone call comes from a live person having the ability to
Mhm,
say what comes to their mind, and they may come off script. They may, be
mhm.
reacting or responding to something. And we spend so much time and energy with tools like Call Miner and collaboration
Yeah,
room.ai trying to evaluate what's going on with this live
yeah,
person on the phone. But these pre-scripted text messages and emails and things that are being sent that have already been reviewed by an attorney. I feel like you've got more control over the communications that are going back and forth. And I think that
mhm,
that makes a serious difference. And just like you were talking about the Verizons and the
mhm,
AT&Ts and the T-Mobiles of the world on the email side, I think we need to deal with the same thing because most
mhm,
consumers aren't going to have a private domain, right? Like they're not going to have their own
mhm.
email server set up in their home. They're going to be
Yep.
using a Gmail, a Hotmail,
Mhm,
AOL.com or one of these other free email services. And we have to deal with the same things on those sides, right?
mhm.
Are they going to let the email through because they've recognized our domain as a problem, or they've recognized that
Right.
these messages have specific language that's being sent? And so there's the CFPB, and then there's also the Can Spam Act, which we have to deal with on both text and email. And
Mhm,
there's so many other aspects to compliance as it relates to digital communications that I think a lot of that gets lost in the shuffle when people are starting to think about it. But on the
mhm.
other side of the equation, if we can drive people to these self-service portals, so if we can use a digital communication, we can drive people to a self-service portal to where they can extend the experience they had with the bank, right? So a consumer, when they're still a Bank of America customer, for example, they're in there, they can check their
Right.
balance, they can see their statements, they can do everything. And the more that we can extend that experience into the post charge off world, I think one, the more comfortable the consumer is, because they see that there's been this investment. If you've got like if you're sending them over to a portal that looks like it was made in 1980, they're probably, if it's got that MySpace feel, they're probably not going to be as confident in your
Right.
organization, and you have a higher probability of complaints. So there are some things that we need to consider from a digital perspective, but getting the not having them on the phone with a live collector's got to make a massive difference in terms of what they're,
Yes.
how comfortable they are in communicating.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Which brings me to something else that has been top of my mind recently, which has been, I think we need to rethink what the digital collector looks like.
Mhm.
So let's say
Okay.
you want a two-way texting, you want someone who's responding on social media as comments come in, or even complaints or compliments come in. Someone who responds to any negative reviews on Google, someone who um, I said two-way text messaging, but two-way, say through the WhatsApp, email. If you want to get it out of template form so it's not all robotic, you need to think about it's probably not the phone collector
Mhm.
who's doing that. And so what I think I'm seeing is we're trying to take phone collectors and make them digital collectors, but just because they can negotiate through a conversation doesn't mean that they can type words. I'm just like, I know that sounds silly,
No,
but
it
like
doesn't sound
doesn't
silly. It
mean
makes
that
a
they
lot of
can't
sense.
for it doesn't mean that they can do that, right?
Sure.
Um, I think there's a different skill set that you're going to need to train to because tone is isn't depicted through written communication. So you
Mhm.
need to, you need to be careful with certain words. I had a really cool experience. It wasn't actually cool. My flight was canceled, but I saved all these text messages. So Delta now, it was in the Atlanta airport, and everything is, anyone who's been flying recently knows that it's just been a nightmare. So The whole terminal customer service is all backed up. Normally I would call because I'm platinum and I get right through. This time they said, "Are you an iOS user, Android, press 1 or 2, and we'll take care of your issue via text." Okay. I had a text said someone's going to be with you in approximately 12 minutes. So I got the automated attendant. Then by the time I got down to baggage claim to reroute my bag, I had gotten my credit, everything was taken care of, and it was all done but via text. And then I got a survey at the end of it. How was the attendant? Did did they answer
Mhm.
your questions? I had like 5 questions to answer. And I'm like, this is where our industry needs to go. We need to be
Mhm.
solving problems for consumers as quickly as reasonably possible in the method and the communication channel that they want to communicate with us by. And that was super simple for me to do. And I was pretty impressed by the whole thing. Like,
True
honestly,
omni-channel, right? Like
yeah,
that's true omni-channel. That
yes,
is the entire purpose of omni-channel communications, is being able to tie those things together into a single experience, right? To
right.
be able to go from the phone to text message or to email or to chat or to
Mm-hmm.
whatever your preference is, and everybody's got a different preference, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody wants to treat these things differently. And let's be perfectly honest, right? Like where the age bracket is coming down in terms of
Mm-hmm.
communication, there's a large gap, right? Like my mom's on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, right? Somebody else is on something else. And
Mm-hmm.
I still can't figure out Snapchat. So go figure. Right?
I
Like,
haven't even tried, Adam. I haven't even tried.
there's just so many different, like, and you see a shift in the communication channels or the communication preferences based on age brackets, based on
Mm-hmm.
demographics, based on device access, right? There's so many different variations here, but that's really interesting, and the perfect balance of compliance and performance, right? Like, can we be
Mm-hmm.
compliant in this new space while continuing to push those performance limitations or those performance limits, and bring ourselves into the next level of being able to collect? Because the easier or the more comfortable we're making the experience for the consumer, the easier it is for us to ultimately solicit and collect
Right.
payments.
And speaking of something you're really great at, Adam, is, I mean, then we can start kind of marketing ourselves as
Mhm.
an easy company to just come and work with, right? Like, we are traditionally bad marketers. We think that nobody wants to hear from us and that everyone hates us. But I think that as we shift to this true omni-channel solution, self-service options, and we're doing it, creating frictionless experiences for
Mhm.
consumers, that's what they want, right? Um, then we can start to market, and our Google reviews will reflect that. We can have
Mhm.
testimonials, and there's companies out there that are doing a really good job of spotlighting those testimonials. Um, but I want to see our whole industry doing that, because that's the
Yes.
only way that we change the narrative at the federal level
I
and the
agree
state level.
wholeheartedly across the board.
Hmm.
The more that we can create these positive experiences, the better off we are as an industry on the whole. And I think it's important that organizations within our space continue to talk about their involvement in the community, how active they are, the jobs that they're creating. I think it's time for us to own the narrative of our own organization. And I think that's incredibly important. I was recently at the ACA conference where you and I got a chance to hang out, and I was talking with someone who was a collector, and I asked him what he did, and he kind of beat around the bush for a while, and finally I was like, "You're a debt collector. You're a collector." And he's like,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, I'm a collector." And I said, "Well, be proud of that. For these 5 reasons, you are an essential part of our economy.
Right.
Accept who we are and let's talk about it. We're not bad people. We're here to actually
Yeah.
help people resolve their outstanding accounts. Let's have that conversation. Let's
Hmm.
control that narrative, and let's be part of the discussion, because we're out there having conversations with the legislators and the regulators and educating them on all of these valuable things. We're creating financial literacy content for consumers. We are actually trying to help people, but we're also trying to balance interest rates, right? We're trying to
Hmm.
balance the availability of credit and all these other
Hmm.
great things that our industry does in a
Yeah.
credit based economy.
I think, for the operators who may be listening, to us talk today, I hope they go back and remind their teams of that, because I find that that still is missed in the conversation. I think maybe it's talked about in training upon new hire, but I think it's important to reiterate that.
Mhm.
Um, on a regular basis that this job is really critical to our entire economic system here in the United
This is
States.
a
Like,
speech I give every time I walk into an agency, right? Every time I
yeah,
walk into an agency or a vendor or any organization across our entire industry, they generally ask me to say a few words to the organization. And I'm always pushing to make sure people understand how proud they should be of the industry that they work in, that we have great
mhm,
people here, and that we are actually trying to solve problems. Sarah, I
yeah.
can't thank you enough for coming on today. I am so glad that you and I finally had an opportunity to film an episode together. This was a lot of fun. You've got some really great perspectives, and I love the way that you're starting to find that balance for organizations between performance and compliance because your unique perspective is needed.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. For those of you that are watching, please feel free to leave comments or questions below. Both Sarah and I will be responding to questions on LinkedIn and YouTube. If you have additional topics that you'd like to see us cover, you can leave those in the comments below as well. And I'll be tagging Sarah and her company in the comments and details below so that you can reach out to her directly if you have any additional questions or want to learn more about her products and services. But until next time, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you everybody for watching.